probably one of the most well-known emblems of the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, totem poles. These giant wood carvings decorated their villages and were very important symbols. Although the tradition of creating them spans the entire northwest coast, from Alaska to Washington state, this film will try and address why, how, and when these enormous wooden poles were raised, as well as examine the various motifs carved into them and their meanings. According to indigenous sources, the tradition of creating totem poles began long ago in ancient times, when the ancestors set upon great trials and tribulations, speaking with the spirits and fighting evil monsters. During the time of great warriors who won many victories, the totem poles were erected to remember these stories of old, retold at the potlatch celebration events. There were also memorial poles carved by some tribes to commemorate ancestors, and there were mortuary poles, which some tribes would create to place the remains of their dead in. Another notable example of the wood pole carvings of the Pacific Northwest are the shame poles. As the name suggests, they were created to ridicule neighboring groups that had unpaid debts. Out of all of these, the totem and memorial poles were the largest. According to the archaeological record, there are 3 influences behind the creation of totem poles. 1. The carved house poles of the Fraser River. 2. Small graveyard figures that extend all the way into the Bering area and even Siberia. And 3. Miniature carvings of stone, ivory, and wood that are dated back to ancient times. Surprisingly, late 18th century English, Russian, and Spanish accounts reference many aspects and artifacts that are familiar with Pacific Northwest cultures, such as their painted longhouses, but they do not mention these giant carved poles. It isn't until the 1830s that the first accounts of totem poles are attested. For example, Haida poles began to show up in the 1840s and 50s, and they began to be commonplace across nations of the Pacific Northwest. Why was this? Scholars have attributed the rise in totem pole production to many factors, notable of which is the fur trade. This is where the first interactions with Europeans, who by now built forts and settlements to acquire pelts, and where the natives became introduced to the global trade network, where they traded pelts with them for iron tools. These could be used to cut down large cedar trees and carve wood more precisely. The first motifs that were carved had to do with creatures from nature that were basically their family crests. The 4 primary figures adorning these poles are eagle, wolf, raven, and thunderbird. Other common motifs include frogs, finback whales, bears, owls, halibut, orcas, salmon, woodpecker, shark, the split person, mountain goat, puma, moon, stars, rainbow, and starfish, the latter half of these appearing on later poles. Because of the fur trade, the indigenous groups of the Pacific Northwest were eager to show off their wealth through their own means, which led to the creation of the first totem poles, to show off their wealth from the fur trade with being able to fell down a large cedar tree and carve intricate motifs with the iron tools they acquired through trade. This was also a way to show off their family history and the symbols attributed to them, like the heraldic crests of Europe. Each pole told a story. This is why totem poles were placed in front of the longhouses on the waterfront of rich and important families, sometimes with a little fence built around them. They were flanked by smaller, older memorial poles and graveyard figures. Exceptions to this are the Haida, the Nass River people, and the Southern Tlingit, who'd place their poles at the village front. To make it clear as aforementioned, they were always facing the waterfront, as the rivers and oceans were the highways of these peoples, where everyone could see their wealth and status presented through these totem poles. We will now look at the Tsimshian people on the border of Alaska, British Columbia, and their totem pole raising tradition. First, the owner of the future pole had to select the tree and gather all the supplies. Then family and family friends were asked to help with the process, and in return they would be fed. A carver was chosen from among them, who would transfer all the credit to the owner. It was the owner who would choose what emblems would be carved into the pole, including in that the symbols that represented his clan. Lastly, the most difficult part came, raising the pole. This was a grand occasion, therefore invitations were sent out not only to the village, but to other villages in the area to witness. There would be celebration, called a potlatch, full of dancing, food, and gift giving, and then the pole would be erected into place. When the owner of the pole died, his nephew was in charge of it. In all totem building traditions, there is the belief of leaving totem poles as they are, with very little maintenance as possible, as the pole, made of wood, would return back to the earth. Totem poles have also been at the center of some feuds, which led to conflict and even bloodshed. One episode from the 1800s recounted from the indigenous peoples of the lower Nass River in British Columbia told of Sispigut of the Blackfish clan. He wanted to create the tallest and most ornate totem pole of all the river tribes with the name Fin of the Blackfish, to make sure other clans knew of his power. To add insult to injury, by custom the work of the carver fell to a man named Hladir, leader of the Wolf clan. But Sispigut preferred Oye, a carver upriver who was renowned for his works, the most recent at the time being a grizzly bear totem pole he had carved. Of course this enraged Hladir, who warned Sispigut again and again not to build a pole larger than his. The latter ignored his warnings, continuing to share invitations to the future pole raising ceremony. One day when Hladir was passing in his canoe, he shot and wounded Sispigut, and thus the ceremony was postponed for next year. But Hladir, in his cunning, got one of his subordinates to murder Sispigut. This wasn't the end of Hladir's reign of terror. He bullied another clan into cutting their totem pole in half twice. His power was only checked when he tried exerting his authority to a village upstream. It is said the end of the golden age of totem pole carving came in the 1880s to 1890s. With the population becoming Christianized, a fervor arose amongst the evangelized peoples and their newfound faith, specifically among some of the Haida and southern Tlingit. They destroyed many of the poles. Another reason for the end of the golden age was due to many of the populations moving, abandoning their villages, and their poles left to rot. A few were conserved where they stood generations later, or were transported to museums. But is this the case? Many totem poles have been carved since the latter half of the 20th century, these new carvers sticking to traditions while using power tools and adding new motifs alongside traditional ones. This combination of old and new has helped keep this beautiful tradition of wood carving alive, and if you're in the Pacific Northwest today, you can see many of these creations in parks and other public areas.